Hello. Welcome. I'm Andrew Weinstein, a professor in the history of art and chair of the Holocaust Commemoration Committee. Since 2002, the committee has sponsored a program each year in conjunction, generally on the calendar, with Holocaust Remembrance Today. And we're delighted this year to offer Women, Textiles, and the Arts. At this difficult time in the world today, with innocent civilians in Ukraine, Israel, and Gaza subject to deadly and traumatizing experiences, it's edifying to consider how art has the power to alleviate at least some of the effects of trauma. This year, we examine artistic responses to the Holocaust, which, among the many horrors and persecutions committed by the Nazis and their collaborators, involved the systematic, industrialized genocide of 6 million Jews in gas chambers and by bullets. For traumatized survivors and for their children and grandchildren who have inherited the trauma through family stories and silences, and biologically through epigenetics, the creation of art can be therapeutic. Through textile arts, the repetitive actions of knitting, sewing, and embroidery can serve as a meditation and as a way of seeming to master what is, in the end, an unmasterable past. Our first panelist, Tanya Singer, founder of Knitting Hope, came to her craft in 2017 as a means of coping with a medical trauma, brain injury for her son, which turned out successfully in surgery. Through that difficult personal experience, she subsequently discovered how knitting had fostered resistance and renewal among knitters during and after the Holocaust. A contributor to Tablet magazine, Vogue Knitting magazine, Modern Daily Knitting, Kveller, and the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, Ms. Singer works at Tablet magazine, where she co-hosts the Beautifully Jewish podcast series. She holds a BA with honors from Wellesley College, where the quote-unquote little sister whom she mentored there was the first person to teach her to knit. Since that time, she has taught knitting to children and inspired other adults to do so. Textile art, through the subjects it depicts, can also bear witness to trauma, something our second panelist, Bernice Steinhardt, knows well. Ms. Steinhardt is the founding president of Art and Remembrance, a nonprofit arts and education organization which, since its founding in 2003, has sponsored a traveling exhibition of the textile art of Esther Krinitz, who was a Holocaust survivor and Ms. Steinhardt's mother. Late in life, Esther Krinitz created a series of fabric panels that depict her experiences as a teenage girl during the Holocaust so that her own daughters might understand what she went through. The fabric panels have been displayed at more than 40 museums and other venues in the United States, Canada, and Poland. Ms. Steinhardt is the co-author, with her mother posthumously, of Memories of Survival, and is also the executive producer of the award-winning film, Through the Eye of the Needle, The Art of Esther Nisenthal Krinitz. High-quality prints of a selection of Krinitz's fabric panels are currently on display in the Feldman Lobby through April 18th, a week from today. Our own fashion historian at FIT, Professor Natalie Nudell, will moderate a discussion with Ms. Singer and Ms. Steinhardt. Professor Nudell, known for her groundbreaking academic research on the academic calendar and its publisher, Ruth Findlay, has produced and written the 2020 documentary about Findlay called Calendar Girl. Her historical monograph in American fashion, Ruth Findlay's Fashion Calendar, will be published by Bloomsbury Press later this year. And her scholarly and popular articles have been published in the Hidden History of American Fashion, also from Bloomsbury, and also the Journal of American Culture, the Ephemera Journal, and other publications. She is an associate editor of the Fashion Studies Journal and a founding member of the Fashion Studies Alliance. Before I turn over the afternoon to Professor Nudell, I want to thank the benefactors who have made our panel and our exhibition possible. Above all, I thank Dr. Patrick Nisley, Dean of the School of Liberal Arts and Sciences, for his phenomenally generous financial and, for that matter, spiritual support. There can be no dean who supports his faculty more passionately than Dean Nisley. I'm no less thankful to Troy Richards, Dean of the School of Art and Design, for his extremely generous support, and to Dr. Tardis Johnson, a committed member of our committee, for monies provided on behalf of his office, enrollment management, and student success. Finally, I thank Deliwe Kakana, Chief Diversity Officer of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, for her ongoing guidance and financial support year after year. At long last, I now turn over the program to Professor Nudell.
Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I just would like to mention that an earlier version of this program was organized on September 6, 2023 at the Montreal Holocaust Museum in Montreal, Canada. FIT's Holocaust Commemoration Committee would like to thank Kat Ramanow, Marie-Blanche Fourcade, and Sarah Berger from the Montreal Holocaust Museum for their support of us recreating the event here at FIT. And here are some photos from the September event. So we will start with you, Bernice. And Bernice, please share with us a brief bio of your mom, Esther Nisenthal Krinitz, and why you and your sister decided to start Art and Remembrance.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about my mother's story. She was 12 years, My mother was 12 years old in 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland, and they came straight to her village, a little tiny village in the center of Poland. And they occupied her village for 3 years. And then in October 1942, they ordered all the Jews of the whole region to report to a train station in a nearby city. My mother and they were warned that anyone who was found in their homes after 10 o'clock on that day, October 15th, would be shot. My mother refused to go. She was 15, and although she had no idea where they were going to go, she had just lived through 3 years of German occupation, so she knew it wasn't going to be good. And she begged her father to give her the name of a friend of his, a farmer, non-Jewish, in another town where they could go and work. She wanted to take her next youngest sister, Manya. She didn't want to go by herself. She wanted Manya to come with her. So the next morning of October 15th, they said goodbye to their family, her parents and her older brother and 2 younger sisters, and they never saw them again. So my whole life, I heard all these stories of my mother's, her stories of her childhood, her stories of her survival during the war, and finally her arrival in the United States. But when my mother was about 50, she decided that she really wanted my sister and me to see what her home and her family looked like. She was never trained as an artist. She didn't know how to draw, but she could sew anything. She had been apprenticed to a dressmaker when she was 8 years old, and she never stopped sewing after that. So she did what she could do best, which was to take a large piece of fabric and fill it in with stitches. And I believe that first picture is on display, at least a very good photograph of it in the lobby. So I encourage you to take a look at it. So for me and my sister, well, just to return to her construction of these, she went on over the next couple of decades to create altogether a series, what turned out to be a series of 36 pictures. And when she finished them, she would give them to me because I lived nearby. So I had all these pictures. First they were all on my walls, but then I ran out of wall space. And it was clear, though, that they needed to be out in the world. So my mother sadly died in 2001. But after that, my sister and I decided to start Art in Remembrance, our nonprofit organization, to help us get my mother's work out into the world where they've been seen by thousands and thousands of people now. So that's the story of Art in Remembrance.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I have now put my childhood home on the screen behind us, your mom's first panel. And we know that she was a shop owner and seamstress in Brooklyn. And so can you tell us, you mentioned briefly how she learned how to craft and sew, but could you give us a little bit more insight into when she started making them, at what point in her life, and sort of what materials she would have used or how she would have accumulated the fabrics that she paneled together?
Yeah. Well, the first two pictures, so this is the first one that I was alluding to earlier. This picture is quite large. It's about 4 feet by 4 feet. And she used, some kind of hopsacking, or kind of homespun kind of fabric. And she filled it in with many, many stitches. It was all crewel work. And she was very satisfied with it when she finished, because she thought it captured what was in her mind's eye. And she went on to create a companion piece. She gave this one to me because I'm the older daughter, and she made a companion piece for my sister, which was completely filled in with stitches. And then she did what she had set out to do, and then she set the work aside. But about 10 years later, she returned to these memory pictures, and she started using fabric collage as well as embroidery, because I think at that point she knew she was going to tell a longer story, a more complete story, and it was just too time-consuming to do it all in embroidery stitches, as in the first two. So she was, maybe when we look at some of the other pictures, I'll talk more about.
I just put up
the Passover one, yeah. So some of her pictures, she did several that were done before, that of memories from before the war. And this one seemed very timely. This is the last Passover, or in preparation for the last Passover in Nishik, her village. All the women gathered in the house of Muttel, the shoemaker, who had the best oven. And actually you can see on the right side of the picture, you can see pairs of shoes hanging there. And there's Muttel and his son baking the matzahs. But the women in the village were making, each one made their own matzahs. And my mother, in the back of the picture, she included her mother, who she said made the best matzahs in Nishik. I wanted to just point out, and she also in the caption noted that this was the last Passover that they celebrated in Nishik. This is in 1939, I guess. She was very thoughtful about her fabric. She looked for fabric that matched her memory of what she saw in real life. So the fabric that she used for the damask curtains resembled what she remembered in Muttel's house. And so she was very pleased that she could capture that memory more closely. And in this picture also, you can see that she used a little bit of fabric paint to create the heat of the oven and the char just above the oven. And maybe in some of the other pictures, I'll point out some other aspects. Oh, just one that I wanted to mention. You'll notice in this picture, the border is of this beautiful blue. When she was working on the pictures of her survival, so during the war years, all those pictures, which were the majority of the pictures, are bordered in black. So she used the borders, the border colors, as one way of separating time in her chronology.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And in the exhibition, we grouped the panels in that way. So I hope you all are able to see those after the exhibition, after the talk. Tanya, thank you so much for joining us. And what is your relationship to textiles, and what brought you to your project, Knitting Hope?
I should say I have no relation to the Singer sewing machine. I wish that I did. People do ask me that. But my grandfather was an immigrant from Europe, and he was a tailor. And it's a very common story, especially in Jewish families, as we all have connections that way. And I was always drawn to textiles. His wife, my bubby, was a crocheter. I joke about it. I mean, she didn't have the best color sense, but boy, she had beautiful work, and everyone had big, itchy acrylic blankets that she made, and just so much love, so much giving. And the joke part is, for anyone, you're all much too young to know about these toilet paper covers, but you can Google them. They're hilarious. We should bring them back. These little crocheted dolls, and it's sort of like Anna Garumi has picked that up and made it cool. They weren't that cool. They were sort of odd, but they would be in these 70s colors of mustard yellow and avocado green, and you can picture every surface sort of crocheted or knitted in their apartment, and it was magical to me, and I was always drawn to it. But it wasn't something, she passed away when I was very young, and it wasn't something that I really thought I could do. I didn't think of myself as coordinated or precise enough to be good at making things. But it was always a draw. I was always touching things and so on and so forth. And I started to learn to knit when my son was in kindergarten. And there was a local knit shop, which unfortunately has gone out of business now. And I took lessons, and I thought, like, I actually can do this. Like, this is really enjoyable. But I was working and very involved in a million other things, so I put it to the side until just 6 months after his bar mitzvah, we found out he had a brain tumor, which required brain surgery. So my immediate instinct was to wrap him in this blanket I had started when he was a very little boy. And I can't explain it to you, but you're people who probably understand this instinct, that like there's a place where words fail. There's not like a thing I wanted to buy. It was that I wanted to finish making that blanket. So I said, I gotta get my act together, I gotta finish this blanket, I have to make this a focus. And from then on, from the day we left for the hospital for surgery, which was successful, thank goodness, I've been knitting. And I always have, my husband will say, does there have to be yarn in every room in the house? Yes, the answer is yes, something has to be. It just sort of creeps throughout all aspects of my life. And it wasn't until, sort of by accident, I read a story just about this time of year, Passover, about 5 or 6 years ago, that led me to realize that women, of course, and some men, knit during the worst of times, which I thought of was the worst of times at the time, which was the Holocaust. And to me, it made perfect sense. And I became totally fascinated by this and couldn't stop researching it. And so I have many, many stories and some objects to share with you as we progress. And I started Knitting Hope as a project. Are there any hand knitters here? Other hand knitters here? Yeah, I see some hands going up. So they know that there's a real community in knitting and that we enjoy making things together. And so it became sort of Knitting Hope became a place of learning, but also like a way to build community and keep these stories alive and honor the memories of the makers who created objects that meant so much.
It's an incredible project. And on the screen behind us, we have a photograph of Eva Bender. And I know that she very much used knitting during her experience. Would you tell us a little bit about her story?
This is a book that I brought that Eva's brother Sam wrote. And as I mentioned, my grandparents, my grandfather was an immigrant, my grandmother on the other side were immigrants, and so I sort of grew up with those voices from Eastern Europe and the sounds and the flavors and the smells of their home and the way that they ate. And they died when I was young, and I sort of have always missed that. And Sam and Eva live in New York. They live in Riverdale, and so I get to see them, and they are in their 90s, and they're incredible. They still have this brother-sister dynamic that's amazing. But when they were small children, Eva can very vividly explain, like, when Stalin marched into their town, which is Chernovitz, Romania, which is now Ukraine. So it's like history just repeating itself, of course. And she can remember Russian troops being billeted in the family apartment. So it's kind of amazing. And she spent a year learning Russian. Before then, the Russians were like, actually, Hitler, you can have this. And so the family were moved. They stayed together. Sam, who wrote this book, was an amazing violinist. And the family was about to send him to Russia to be a part of a violin program, and decided to stay together. And so they stayed together and were all sent from their home. They were among the lucky ones who weren't just mass executed, which is what happened to most of the Jews from their community. And they were sent to a place called Transnistria, which is basically no man's land. And they were sort of dumped there with no food and resources. And it wasn't so much a concentration camp that was tightly guarded like we see in movies, but it was guarded. And there was nothing to eat, so they had whatever they could bring with them. And the Ukrainian peasant women whose husbands were taken off to war were trying to survive as well, and they were sort of bartering through the gate, through the fences. And Eva's mother had a hand knit, and the Ukrainian peasants were like mesmerized that like you could do that, you could make things. We have animals, we have wool, so they ended up sort of sneaking out and processing the wool and then knitting roughly a sweater a week, which is like wild for the hand knitters here. That's really fast. It's a lot of knitting, but when you're knitting for food, you're going to find a productivity you didn't know you had. And they would get, if they were lucky, like a piece of bread, and they would share it. So their father passed away really quickly of typhus, but the three survived, and they really survived by knitting. And Eva became, it was a wonderful story. She and her husband, much later, when they came to America, had a suit shop on the Lower East Side and outfitted. They know every rabbi in the tri-state area. They know everybody, and it's an incredible, again, through fabric. And she would sit and needlepoint in the shop to sort of like stay out of the business, which she calls a nonprofit that wasn't meant to be a nonprofit, but it was just like a giving, beautiful sort of connection to textiles. And so she and Sam both knit to survive, and it was a surprise to me to find not only that connection to what I was missing in my grandparents, but that they also had this, we have this in our own family history.
Wow, that's an incredible story. I also wanted to ask you about the story of Liselott Ivry, which is a story we shared at the Montreal event because her textile is part of the collection over there.
Yeah, she's incredible crafter, and this happens, a lot of us start with one thing and end up doing many things. Liselott was the first survivor who I sat down with who wasn't in my family when I started doing research, and her home was filled with tile work, crochet, knitting, glass, mural, glass. She was just a constant creator, and there she is knitting for charity. Her mother was, we're talking about moms and big embroidered panels. She was born in an area that's now considered the Czech Republic, and the home was cold. It was a family home for many generations, and her mother embroidered massive panels to sort of warm up the apartment. And they'd sit at night around a stove for heat, and they'd they'd knit and embroider these panels. And so when we spoke, she brought me to tears. She sang the Czech national anthem, which is in both Czech and German, which the words are, "Where is home?" And this woman who lost her mother and brother and father and had no family, I said, so where is home for you? And she said, home is nowhere. And I like to think that her creative endeavors are that reaching for home, that sort of recreating home. And she's now passed away, but she was such an inspiration to me. I have some of her paintings, and I have a needlepoint pillow that her family were going to throw out after she passed away. And I was like, no, you're not. I'll drive to Montreal, take things. So thankfully, they shared those with me. And this scarf, this headscarf that you see was the first, imagine you're deprived of everything, of every sensory pleasure. And for us, these tactile people, beauty, color, fabric, she saw a Roma woman with this headscarf, and she was working in the kitchen at Bergen-Belsen on Liberation, which she was like, I'm going to be where the good stuff is, I'm going to be where the food is. And she was so desperate for food, she used to put butter in her bra to sneak back, imagine that, to sneak it back to her friends, imagine it not melting. All of that is a lot to understand. But she was so desperate that she sort of snuck a piece of bread and traded a piece of bread for this piece of fabric. She was so desperate for that textile. And she never even wore it, because when she opened it up, there were lice inside. And for anyone who's sort of paid any attention to Holocaust, you know that's a very common thing, is sort of lice infestation. So she saw the lice and was like, I don't even care, I'm keeping this thing. And she kept it with her from Bergen-Belsen all the way back to Canada, and then donated it to the museum.
Incredible.
And there she was. Okay, one more sweater, and we're on the theme of Passover today.
Yes.
This is the woman who started it all for me, Helena Weinrausch. She's incredible. She is just the most stunning. She's like a Hollywood starlet to me. She's just this like incredible, beautiful, luminous woman. She ballroom dances, which she learned later in life. And I read this story about her bright blue sweater, which was knit for her by a fellow survivor named Anne Rothman, who knit for Nazi wives when she was in the Lodz ghetto. And that was the first story that I read that was like, of course you would knit to survive. You would do whatever you could to survive, if anything. So, and then to be free and to make a sweater that Angora at the time, Angora was like this real Hollywood starlet thing. Anyone ever work with Angora? It's not so much in use because of animal cruelty issues, but this would have been such a luxury to have after the war, to be given, to be left for dead, and then to, within a couple of years, to be gifted a sweater like this. And when Anne gave this to Helena in Sweden, she said, wear it to remember them. And she's worn it every Passover since. For the time, it was 75 years. She wore this. This is her Passover sweater. She only wears it for Passover. And to me, it sort of, I love this story for so many reasons, but especially because the sweater has become a ritual object for her. And when we think of a Passover table or a holiday table, we don't think of a sweater. And that this is the sort of the status of this knit. So I knit my version of it. It's not Angora. It's Surrey alpaca, and it's not as fitted. I don't look like Helena. And then I did a knit along with other knitters and worked with a knitter to publish a pattern to hand knit this sweater. And the QR code will take you there, but it's really just about like, sort of, we knit this during the pandemic, a group of knitters, and it really gave us like a feeling of like, times have been hard, and we're free, and things are going to be better. And it's important to sort of keep those messages front of mind, and if we can do it through something we love, like knitting, even better.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing all of that amazing, incredible research. Back to you, Bernice. We will go through the next series of panels. Here we have, I was thinking we'll go through each panel and you could explain to us what is going on. What are we seeing? This particular panel is called Janizu Prison Camp. Yanishev, I'm sorry. I'm so bad with the Polish words. Do you have your microphone? Yeah, there we go. So can you tell us a little bit about this panel, please?
So in this scene, my mother is recalling a time, this is now June 1941. And so the Germans, the occupation was about a year and a half in. And my mother and her sister, Manya, who is depicted there with her, the two oldest girls, had gone to work for neighbors, Polish farmers. Jews at this point were no longer allowed to own livestock, which posed a real hardship for her family because her father was a horse trader. He would travel around the countryside buying and selling horses. And her mother raised poultry, ducks and chickens and geese, that she would sell at market. So their livelihoods were cut off. And so the two oldest girls went to work for farmers to help the family survive. And on this beautiful day in June, my mother decided to take the cows that they were tending for their farmers down to the good pasture near the Vistula River, which is the main river that runs north-south in Poland. And when they got to the good pasture that my mother was heading for, she realized that they were next to this prison camp. This had been a prison camp from before the war where they would bring Polish prisoners to rebuild this earthen dam, which would get flooded every spring. But the Germans, when they arrived, turned it into a slave labor camp, and they imprisoned their young Jewish men and boys to rebuild the dam. So my mother could see, when she got there, she looked through this line of trees, and she could see that they were right next to this prison camp. And she could see how there were prisoners being beaten, and when they were too exhausted to work, they would be led into the birch forest. And you can see in the lower left-hand corner of the picture, a soldier is at gunpoint leading a boy into the forest to be shot. And my mother said she just heard shots, one after another, while standing there. And after she watched all of this, the two girls took their cows and went back home. So when I saw this picture, I would see all of my mother's pictures every week. We would have dinner at my parents' house. Among her many talents, my mother was a fantastic cook. So we would go up for dinner on Sundays, and I would see the works in progress and the finished works as well. And when I saw this picture, I loved all of her pictures, but when I saw this one, I was truly awestruck. She had figured out how to capture in this one single image these two dimensions, at least, of the war. On the one side was this beauty, the details of the flowers growing and the trees filled with fruit, and the lushness of the pasture. And when you look at the picture in the hall, in the lobby, you can see she stitched every single blade of grass. So on the one side, there's this vivid color, because this was what life was like, was filled with beauty on the one side. But on the other side, it was filled with the brutality and terror of the war, and it's almost devoid of color. It's just this sort of brown and beige, and there's so much dynamism in contrast to the peacefulness of the pasture. And my mother never titled any of her pictures, but I always thought of this picture as heaven and hell. And years ago, I was showing some of my mother's images to a fourth grade class, actually here at Hunter College Elementary School. And I asked the kids, when I showed them this picture, what they thought of it. And one fourth grader raised his hand and he said, "This picture shows me that there's a thin line between good and evil." Really insightful.
Very insightful. And now we have the road to Krasnik.
So this is now October 15th, 1942, the day that the Jews were ordered to leave their homes and report to the train station in Krasnik, a nearby city. And my mother and my aunt, her sister, had been intending to go with a neighbor, was supposed to take them to the father's friend named Stefan, whom my mother thought they could go to work for. He lived in another village. But she abandoned them. They left and came back to the road where all the Jews were walking to the train station. And there they met up with their cousin Dina, who was walking along the road with her baby. And Manya, who was 13 at the time, 2 years younger than my mother, she just wanted to stay with Dina, their cousin, in hopes that they would rejoin their parents and the rest of their family. And because Manya had never wanted to go with my mother, and it was only because their mother told her to go with Esther that she listened. But they reached this point on the road where my mother realized that they were soon going to be in Krasnik at the train station, and she just couldn't bear to go on. So she started pulling Manya off the road, but Manya wanted to stay with Dina. And it wasn't until Dina said, Manya, go with Esther. And so she did. And the two girls left the road and went to the village of Dombrava, to Stefan's house. But I always said that my aunt survived, Manya survived, because she listened, and my mother survived because she didn't. Well, they went to Stefan's house on their own. He kept them for only a couple of days because he said everybody in Mniszek knew that they had come to him, and if the Germans came, they would kill all of them. And so my mother realized then that they could not survive as Hersch's daughters under their own identity. So she made up these identities for them, these stories, that they were these two Polish Catholic farm girls from a town on the other side of the river who had been separated from their family, and they were looking for work. And they went from one village to another. People just asked for papers. They wanted proof of who they said they were. And of course, they couldn't stay because they had no papers. But they finally came to a village where no one asked them for papers, the village of Grabówka. And my mother went to work for this elderly farmer whose wife was infirm. And she was his housekeeper and farmhand. And she was very fortunate and happy to be there. And she had asked him for permission to put in a garden. And so here she is working in the garden. Another beautiful day in June. This is 1943. And she was tending her strawberries when these two Nazi soldiers just walked up and trampled into her garden, and they tried to talk to her and engage with her. And she just kept her head down, pretended that she couldn't understand them because they were speaking in German, which she could understand. And you can see in the left corner her employer. She called him Dziadek, which is Polish for grandfather. He came out to see what was going on, when all of a sudden the bees that he kept, he had beehives, and you can see them towards the back of the picture. All of a sudden, this swarm of bees came out and started swarming around the two soldiers. And you can see one of them is waving his hat to drive them off. And he said, they finally left, and he said to my mother, why aren't they stinging you? Why aren't they bothering you? For which my mother had no answer, but they left. My mother was always amused by this memory because the bees saved her, she used to say. The bees, that was the day the bees saved me, because they could do what nobody else could do, which was to drive out the Germans. And you can see in this picture too, she has the strawberries that she planted. There are fruit growing on the trees, all sorts of flowers in bloom. You should really take a look at this picture in the lobby because the embroidery, the detail is so exquisite.
Thank you so much for telling us the story about these panels. And this grouping, all four of them have the black frame that you were talking about.
Exactly. Can I just, because I don't want to forget, those of you, I've been encouraging you to look at the pictures, the images in the lobby, but those of you who can and are interested, the original textiles, all 36 of them, plus a couple of other pieces, are in the American Visionary Art Museum, which is a fantastic museum in Baltimore. So if you can get down to Baltimore, I would encourage you to see the original pieces.
Thank you so much for that. Tanya, it is back to you now. We will talk about the little red dress, and we have a real-life little red dress right here with us. So, Tanya, could you tell us about how textiles were used as a form of resistance by Jewish women during the Holocaust and the story of the little red dress?
Yes, so we talked about the blue sweater knit by Anne Rothman, which wasn't knit during the war years. It was knit after the war years in Sweden. But that story made me realize that there were women like Anne who had knit to survive. And so one of the stories I sort of came across was the story of the little red dress. This is a wall. This is a wall in the museum in Skokie, Illinois, the Holocaust Museum, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, which happens to be the third largest Holocaust museum in the world, which I didn't know. And the Skokie community, you're probably all too young to know this, really mobilized to have this museum created because there was a group of Illinois neo-Nazis who wanted to march through Skokie on purpose by design to agitate and terrify the survivors in the community. And the community, rather than sort of hide, of course, they rallied, they fought back, and they decided to build this museum. And Illinois was the first state in the United States to have mandated Holocaust education. At this point, there are about 24 states in America who have mandated Holocaust education, but I say mandate very light. It's a very light mandate. I think Illinois is probably doing the best job of any state that I know of. And so this little red dress, it's tiny. This is a much larger version, was knit for Judy Fleischer-Kolb, who you can see on her mom's lap in that photo wearing that dress, which you as fashion people will be agitated to know was mounted incorrectly. This is like a thing. But the buttons should be on the back, and the buttons are there, of course, to pull the dress over the baby's big head. So anyway, this dress is there. Judy Fleischer-Kolb is alive and docent in the museum and a wonderful speaker. And her family were in a resort town in Germany where they owned a fabric store. You see a theme. All these things are so interwoven. Her grandfather and father were taken by the Nazis on Kristallnacht, for those of you who don't know, which was like a massive state-sponsored pogrom where Jewish businesses were destroyed, synagogues were burned, and very often men were taken away from their families with no notice, no nothing. And her grandmother, who's not seen in the picture, but who's the knitter of the dress, was incredibly resourceful and brave, sold everything in the fabric store that she could, liquidated everything to purchase luxury liner tickets, which was all she could get, to the very last open port in the entire world where Jews could go, which was Shanghai. And so she went to the Nazis. If you could get if you could show tickets, sometimes you could get your men out. So she went with the tickets, and she said, we'll leave. And at this point, the Nazis were like, fine, just get out of our hair. So she was able to get the men back, and then on that trip, Judy's mother, Carla, became pregnant with Judy, who's shown in the picture, and she was born in 1940 in Shanghai. And this is a delightful picture. The fact that there is this picture is kind of incredible, and Judy's family have an incredible number of photographs of their family's journey. And what's so striking about it is Judy talks about her childhood as so normal. Nothing was normal about living in the Shanghai ghetto. As the war escalated, the Japanese came in and seized control of the ghetto. Judy's family were forced into this 1 square mile place that was full of disease, vermin. There was death all around them. And Judy was so taken care of by her loved ones that she didn't really have such an awareness of it, which is incredible. And there are other photos of the family, but they were there for 8 years. It wasn't just the war years. It's a long time. So her entire childhood really was built in Shanghai as a stateless refugee. And when the museum in Skokie was being moved into its new beautiful home, friends of hers in the community of survivors and their children were looking for things to donate to the museum. So she pulled papers and photographs and pulled this photograph and then said, wait a minute, would you guys be interested in the dress? And of course the jaws dropped. You have the dress. So she said, I do have the dress. So she donated the dress, and she had no idea. She said it was actually sort of traumatic to part with the dress, and she says the dress is my grandmother. And again, you sort of think about, as people who make things, how much these objects carry meaning, and how much this dress symbolizes like all the love and normalcy and protection that she felt from her grandmother, Martha, who, again, I think of as the savior of the whole family. I mean, who just was like doing everything she could to get out. So it's really incredible, and this was the first of the knit-alongs that I did again during the pandemic. I worked with a designer, actually, who's an alumnus of FIT, and she designed the dress, and there's a baby wearing the dress, and it was delightful. And there's Judy Fleischer-Kolb in the museum. So we had just that first summer of 2020, when we had a little break and there was that first vaccine, a number of us met in Skokie and donated the dresses. And what you see next to Judy is what's called a teaching trunk. So the Illinois Holocaust Museum, as part of their mandated Illinois' education program, sends trunks to different communities who can't make it into the museum, and they send them really throughout the Midwest. There are thousands of kids who get these trunks every year, and you can see a little red dress in that trunk. And so volunteers, this is funny, when the trunk started, they had a stick, they had a dress on a stick, a cardboard stick, and a knitter saw that and said, like, no way, like, no way you're gonna do that. We'll get this going. And so she approached Lion Brand Yarns and said, could you donate some yarn to the museum? They graciously did. And the knitters went to work. And so we sort of did another round of that, and the museum always needs help with buttons that fall off and tears and so on and so forth. And what's lovely about this story is, like, this is not a replica, as you can see, of Judy's dress. We couldn't get to the museum, we couldn't measure, we couldn't look at gauge, stitches, etc. But it doesn't matter. Like, what matters is that this is something kids can touch and feel. It humanizes this story. You see this case of DVDs and papers and a lot of black and white photos, and when you see a pop of red come out and you see the scale of a little dress, it's arresting, and it's a wake up for kids who really have no understanding of, like, this wasn't a war against another army. This was a war against civilians, against everybody. And so this dress has become like a really powerful teaching tool, and I hope that more and more of these objects can continue to be a Trojan horse, if you will, and bring people, just as your mother's work does. It's like the softness is there, it brings you in, it's alluring, but really it's telling a very hard truth, and I think it's the power of what we make.
Absolutely. And I definitely think that, to bring it back to Bernice and your mother's panels, I think to echo what you said, Tanya, after the war, also how your mom, Bernice, used textiles, I think we're very much in that vein of education and captivating an audience through a story that is really harsh, but in a visual and tactile way that's really engaging. So here we have the panel Maidanic. So could you tell us about this panel, please?
So after the war was still going on, but it had moved west. The Russians were coming through and liberating all the villages and towns and cities along the way. So my mother left Grabovka, where she had been living, and went back to Mnishik, her home, to see if anyone had survived. And when she got there, none of her family was there. And when she spoke to a neighbor, the neighbor didn't know what had happened to the Jews, but she thought that they might have been taken to a concentration camp in Lublin, not terribly far from where they lived, called Majdanek. So my mother went to Majdanek to see if she could find any signs of her family. And here you see her at the entrance to the camp. And the camp is actually very large. It covers a very large area, but for the purposes of the picture, which is also very large to begin with, she had to compress a lot of the important features. So she arrives at the camp, and you can see at the gate where she's entering the camp, there are flowers growing along the barbed wire fence. Because it was August, there were flowers blooming, and my mother never lost sight of the beauty that was in the world. At the same time that these terrible things were happening, she saw the beauty there, and she couldn't keep from including it in her pictures. And so here she's entering the camp, about to enter the camp, which had been liberated by the Russians. And so they took her on a tour. She saw, for the first time, she saw the gas chambers, the crematorium, and at the top of the picture, you can see this bed of human ashes in which these giant cabbages were growing. So after the tour, after she saw all this, my mother joined the Polish army, which was under Soviet command. She was 17 years old, and she went with the army as a soldier to Berlin.
And then our last panel that we have is
So
Coming to America.
after she got to Berlin with the army, she went back to Poland to get Manya, and the two of them went back to Germany to a refugee camp, a DP, displaced persons camp. And that's where she met my father, who was also Polish and had lost most of his family as well during the war. And they got married in the camp. And my aunt met the man that she married in the camp. There were a lot of weddings in this camp. And they had one wedding dress. This is, I never thought about it, but here, since I'm here in this hall of fashion, this dress, this one wedding dress, kind of like the red sweater, when my sister got married, she asked me to make some remarks. I spoke of this one wedding dress that all the brides wore when the photographer came to camp. They shared this one dress for the pictures. And I always thought to myself, this dress must have so much hope and feeling for the future. Just imagining what this one dress embodied, in a sense, all these young people who lost their family and just looking forward to creating new ones. So my father had family, some cousins, living in New York. So he applied for visas for my mother and me, because I was born not long after. And here we are arriving in a place you know well. And my mother recalled that my father's cousin, who had helped sponsor us, arrived and stood with us. Her name was Clara, and she saw me, that's me, in that little pink speck of pink on my father's shoulder, sleeping. And she looked at me and she said, "My dear child, this will be your America." And this picture, you know, the sky is wide open, the birds, the seagulls fill the sky. There's that sense of promise and welcome. America was the place that all Eastern European Jews dreamed of coming, the Golden Medina. It was kind of the promised land. And here my parents had arrived. And I still feel, when I see this picture, when I see the Statue of Liberty itself, I still feel that sense of welcoming and promise that arriving in America must have felt like for them. And I don't see it here, but in that picture, the image I'm looking at, the border is green.
Oh, yeah, it should
You
be
can see
green.
it just looks black.
It just
from
looks
my
black here,
angle.
but
Right.
it should
So
be green.
she once again returned to a new color for the post-war image.
Thank you so much for sharing the arc of the story. And I want to thank you both for being here today. And thank our audience for joining us. If you are interested in more, please follow Tanya Singer on Tanya Singer Knits. And I know that Knitting Hope is a fabulous organization that is actively, coming together and has projects that are ongoing. And thank you so much, Bernice Steinhardt, for joining us.
And if I can just direct you to artandremembrance.org, our website, which has tons of information, resources, a film, a 30-minute film featuring my mother, telling her story. It has all kinds of educational resources as well, so
Yes.
lots to look for there.
Yes, please visit artandremembrance.org to see all the rest of the panels and all of the other programs that the organization puts together. And please join us in the Feldman Lobby to see the exhibition, Fabric of Survival, Images of the Art of Esther and Nisenthal Krinitz, that will be up until the 18th. Thank you so much.